Hello, everyone. My name is Julian Taylor, and I'm a librarian at the English Montreal School Board, and I'm also one of the two co-chairs of the QSLiN Symposium Planning Committee this year. Before we begin, I would like to take a moment to recognize the land upon which we now live was once used by others. The land under my feet here today on the island of Tiohtià:ke, or Montreal, is unceded land that has been used for thousands of years by several different indigenous groups, the most prominent being the Haudenosaunee and the Kayenta. For those of you who would like to review this session again later, it is being recorded and will be made available on the QSLiN YouTube channel as well as on our website. If you do not want to have your image recorded in the video, please ensure that your camera is turned off, and then there'll be nothing to worry about. There will be a number of visuals in this presentation, and in order to try to make things as smooth as possible, the visuals will actually be coming through on my video feed, and Duke will be next to that. You may want to change it to speaker view in the view options in order to guarantee we're seeing both side by side to make things more clear for you. There will also be a period of time at the end of this presentation for questions. If you would like to ask a question, you can just use the chat function, which will be enabled, and write in your questions. Or if you'd rather ask your questions verbally, you can either use the, you can raise your hand, literally, or you can use the reaction functions within Zoom to notify us that you would like to ask a question, and then we will invite you to unmute yourself to pose your question directly. Oh, and also at the end, please remember to re-mute your microphone so that there is less other audio problems. And now, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to today's closing keynote session, Knowing Yourself Starts at Home with Duke Eatmon. Duke, as you may have suspected, was named after the great Duke Ellington by his Afro-Canadian father and his native Canadian mother. He grew up in a household always filled with music and was greatly influenced towards involvement in the world of music. He has been involved in the Montreal music scene for many decades now, although he doesn't look like it, earning many awards and accolades for his contributions, including the Montreal Dynasty Award in 2017 for Best Anglophone Radio Personality of the Year. In 2018, he was laureate for the Black History Month in Montreal. He is a noted CBC broadcaster, author, and music historian, and today he will be talking to us about cultural awareness, pride, racial dignity, and confidence that must be implemented in your life when you're young by your caregivers. So then, without further delay, I would like to invite Duke to take the microphone. Duke.
Thank you, Julian. Before anything, I must thank Julian Taylor. First of all, it was a beautiful introduction. Julian actually reached out to me last year to ask me to be a part of this event, and I graciously accepted and was honored to be asked. During the planning stages of my speaking to you all today, I got to know Julian a bit, especially his family genealogy and history, which I immediately found fascinating and interesting. I felt a kinship between us, and for that I thank you, Julian. After knowing a bit about Julian's family background and history, I can now better understand his passion and dedication to this subject. I'd like to thank the Quebec Schools Librarian Network for putting on this event today. Also sending a thank you out to the English Montreal School Board, of which I was educated in, and the Leslie B. Pearson School Board, of which my children were educated in. I myself was educated first at Maple Hill Elementary School in Montreal North, and then later Summerlet Elementary School in NDG, and that was through my formative years. In high school, I attended Montreal West High, Royal West Academy in Montreal West, and then later at Northmount High and Northmount Alternative in the Côte-des-Neiges district, or Uptown, as we used to call it. To the staff and team of the Library Symposium, whose subject and theme this year, diverse readers, inclusive libraries, I thank you for your initiative and what you're doing. To you, I ask you not to take lightly your endeavor and your efforts, because not everyone cares as much as you do to even put on a symposium with this subject matter on the table. So again, I salute you and thank you. To all our distinguished guests and everyone who participated, I thank you for lending me your ear and your time. I don't take this sort of invitation lightly, given that I only have a very limited amount of formal education myself. My very first hero, the godfather of soul, James Brown, was once told by a fan at the height of his popularity in the late 60s that he was like the Black president. He responded, nah, you need an education to do that. I have no education. You stay in school and get an education, and you can be the Black president. Who knows? Maybe President Barack Obama was a fan of James Brown. I want to thank my children, Jessica and Nathan Eatmon, my parents, Wendell Murray and Linda, my life mate, Keisha Neufeld, the rest of my family and friends, my supporters, my colleagues at the CBC, as well as my colleagues at the Montrealer and the Montreal Community Contact, and of course, my ancestors whose shoulders I stand on today. I want to give a big thanks to my heroes, Prince, Chuck D, James Brown, Jimi Hendrix, Elijah Muhammad, Malcolm X, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Assata Shakur, Aretha Franklin, Maya Angelou, and Miles Davis. May God loosen the knots in my tongue today so that I may make them at least half proud of what it is that I want to share with you. Diverse readers, inclusive libraries. How does one achieve this? Well, for starters, everyone reads, so everyone should be included. As a child, I saw two worlds. As a young Black child with a Black father and Native mother, I saw the world that I lived in, and I saw the world that the library presented. And the two looked nothing alike. But I won't just put libraries on trial for that. The world of television, film, TV commercials, billboards, magazines were also responsible for that. I saw nothing that looked like me or my family in these media platforms as a child. As a matter of fact, going to school in the 1970s, this is not that long ago, I used to see the little Black Sambo books in my elementary school libraries. And I know I'm driving the staff here for the symposium today crazy, given my visuals at the last minute, but we're going to try and share some of those with you. So yes, as a child, the little Black Sambo books were ready and available in the school libraries of my elementary schools, both Maple Hill Elementary, Montreal North, and Summerlett Elementary School in NDG. I once borrowed an Asterix and Obelix book from the library. This was in grade 3. One day I heard my father call me really loud to the living room. He summoned me. He said, "Duke." I knew I was in trouble because the rest of the time, every single person in my family called me Dookie. Some still do. Duke meant serious business. It meant that something was up. I slowly walked to the living room. I said, "Yeah, Dad." And he asked me why I had borrowed this book from my elementary school library. I saw all of my friends borrow Asterix and Obelix books, as they did Tintin and Lucky Luke the Cowboy. These were hardcover books done in comic book form. He asked me what did I think of the book that was written, and he asked me about what I thought was written inside this particular book that I had borrowed from Asterix and Obelix. I told my father I hadn't even read it yet. I'd only took it out the day before, and probably took it out not so much that I was interested in the adventures of Asterix and Obelix, but almost all my classmates were taking out Tintin, Lucky Luke, and Asterix. He said he wanted to look at a passage of the book with me. Asterix and Obelix were from France. These were books that were published in Europe. In the book Asterix and Obelix that I had borrowed, they find themselves on a transatlantic slave ship. And it was interesting. They found themselves on a ship with slaves, where they questioned the characters whose skin was black as coal, with gigantic lips, big wide eyes, and bones in their noses. Asterix and Obelix asked the slaves why they don't get tired of working on the ship all day long and helping to sail the boat. The slaves answered Asterix and Obelix by saying, "Oh no, we're Black slaves. We work for white masters, and we're happy to do so. You can see some of the images on the screen that obviously the Black features on these characters were not complimentary. Now, even in grade 3, I was hurt when my father pointed that out to me. Now, my father was very active in wanting to raise me in a proper manner, instilling racial pride and dignity. So he immediately called a school and called them every name in the book but a child of God. He demanded that all the asterisk books be taken out of the library immediately. That was my dad. That's how he dealt with things. And the school said that they would deal with it. You know the way sometimes some white people in the society can react when a Black man, a big burly Black man like my father, gets when he's upset. So no, they didn't take the Asterix and Obelix books out of the library, but every 2 weeks when the teacher would bring our class to the library, my teacher would instruct me that I could choose anything but the Asterix books, a Band-Aid solution. So it meant that all the elementary school students at Maple Hill could read disturbing images of Black people in the Asterix and Obelix books, except the Black kid of the angry, big Black man. Now, I know a lot of people today aren't happy about what they call cancel culture. Young people call it the cancel culture, but this was a time in the 70s where, in this particular instance, the Asterix books should have been canceled. It's incredible how something that you would borrow from your school library, not even a serious book, something more comical than anything, could affect you. So now these books could still be available in the hands and eyes of young people who had not fully learned to hate and judge yet. Now, I'm telling you, this is what they do to people. This is what happens to you. Your psyche is affected from a really early age. Mine was too. Given the fact that I only really was able to borrow books about Black people once I reached grade 4 and changed elementary school and went to Summerlin and NDG. And even then, these weren't children's books talking about Dr. King or Malcolm X or Harriet Tubman, but in the sports section, maybe Reggie Jackson, Dave Winfield, athletes. Now, I can take you back before that. In kindergarten, I was a bright-eyed, big, bushy Afro kid, excited to be beginning school and playing with kids. I just wanted to leave the house. I was an only child, and nobody was more excited to go to kindergarten than I was. Learning my ABCs, playing in the sandbox. And every week, we had religion class. So not like a Catholic school where you have that 1 hour every day at the end of the day. This was once a week. So for about 45 minutes, my class and the other kindergarten class would go to the gymnasium, and 2 older Caucasian ladies would offer Protestant religious classes. You know, older, sweet-looking ladies who were clearly retired, and they were from the local Protestant church, and they looked like they were somebody's grandmother. You know, looked like they baked apple pies on Sunday and would knit mittens for their grandchildren. Looked like Aunt Bee from the Andy Griffith Show. Their very first lesson, my religion class, was all excited because when you're a grade school kid, you're just excited to leave the classroom, let alone when they taking you to the gym to do something else. In the first lesson, they began with an easel, which they clipped different colors of construction paper on. And they began by clipping a white sheet of construction paper and explained that this paper represented God and Jesus. They said that God and Jesus were good and pure. God and Jesus were about love, which is represented by the color white, and that love is white, and that all that is white is pure and good, like God and Jesus. Then they clipped a black sheet of construction paper on the easel and said, black is bad. And I'm going to try to sort of imitate the way they articulated it. And I remember it like it was yesterday, even though it was kindergarten. And I do remember it like it happened last week. And they said, black is bad. They made sure they extended the word bad. Black is the devil, and all that is black is bad. God and Jesus are not black, so you should learn to hate the color black. God and Jesus hate black, and so should you. I went home that night, excited to tell my parents what I had learned in my first religion class. Now, I was baptized, a Baptist, a Protestant, didn't come from an ultra-religious family. So it's not like I had much religious instruction at home. So I went home and explained that white is the color of good and pure, and that black is bad. Needless to say, they flipped. They went back to the school with me the next day. And there's nothing more embarrassing about going to school with your parents. I mean, at that point, my mother and father used to drop me off in the schoolyard, and that was fine. Either kids were dropped off in the schoolyard by their parents, or they were transported by the school bus, or the older kids would walk by themselves. But having to go back with your parents meant that something was up. Wasn't excited, wasn't happy, and I didn't really understand what was going on. So my parents wanted to speak to the principal and demanded that they also be able to speak to the so-called Bible ladies. Well, the ladies weren't in that day, because like I mentioned, they come once a week. But they would be in the following week. So they set up a meeting with the church ladies for the following week, which of course would follow next Wednesday, Bible Day in the gymnasium. Now, for some reason, at age 6, I was about to be part of a meeting that today nobody would make a 6-year-old privy to, but I was privy to it. And so we returned following week with my parents to meet the Bible ladies. Now, my parents explained why they found disturbing what it is that they were teaching me and the rest of the kids. And I remember the older Bible ladies responded in a very arrogant way. They told my parents if they weren't happy, they could just keep me out of the class. So that very day, they did just that. And for the rest of the year, I did just that. So every Wednesday at 1 p.m., right after lunch, I went to a room in the office next to Mr. Herman's office, our principal, with the Hindu kids, the Jewish students, the Muslim students, and I was there with my own literature to read. There'd be no Bible study for me. Now, my mother had subscribed to a small magazine called Ebony Jr. Those familiar with African-American culture know Ebony Magazine, the first Black American periodical. And Ebony Jr. wasn't available in stores at the time. You had to subscribe to it in the United States, which my mother did. So every week at 1 p.m., I went to the room with the other students with my latest edition of Ebony Jr., with the Jackson 5 on the cover, or maybe Fat Albert and the Cosby Kids. Ebony Jr. featured interviews with Michael Jackson and his little sister, Janet Jackson. We had a Black word search, Black cutout paper dolls for the girls, and Black superhero cutouts for the boys. I would bring my copy of Ebony Jr. with me to the room, wearing my T-shirt purchased in Atlantic City, New Jersey, with the red, black, and green Garvey flag on it, with the caption, "Kiss me, I'm Black." Sorry, church ladies, my mama was ahead of the game. But again, this is what they do to people. This is how you shape young people from an early age, on an intellectual level. And in this particular case, even on a spiritual level. I want to sort of take you on a journey through the formative years of my youth, of how my parents were able to counterbalance all those particular things that affected me. Before I proceed, you can see the banner in back of me. I want to thank the West Island Black Community Association, WIBCA, in the heart of the West Island here in Roxborough, for making their venue available today. It was much better than the sound room that we had procured at CBC. So I want to thank our President Joan Lee, as well as Sister Sion, who helped make our setup here possible. and for making this. WIPCA, less than 5 years ago, was able to burn their mortgage papers, as they now own this beautiful property in the heart of the West Island. They've been around since the early 1980s, and WIPCA is always at the forefront of coming to the aid of people in the Black community in the West Island, and have done incredible work. So I want to send a shout out to them. I'm also joined by a great young journalist and writer by the name of Felix Nadeau, a great young Black writer who's currently journalism student at Concordia. You should read his articles in the Montreal Community Contact, which I also write for. Felix does great articles on everything from politics to sociology to sports, music, entertainment, whatever it is. He also writes for another great quarterly magazine out of Toronto called Reggae Exclusive. So Felix Nadeau, come and show his support here today, and I greatly appreciate it. I want to go back to those incidents that affected me and shaped the way I saw things and the way that I felt I was represented and the way my family was represented, or lack thereof, in popular media, whether it be on television, whether it be in books. I remember rushing home from school every day, like most kids did my age, most boys anyway, to watch Batman. I would get home and Superman would just be ending, the old Superman series from the 1950s, George Reeve. And then Batman would start. I loved Superman, but I was much more of a Batman fan. There was something dark about him, something more of an outlaw figure, maybe sort of in a way that I felt as a young Black child, given everything that was being presented to me in popular media. And as we try to create platforms that are more diverse to include everybody in the society, it starts in so many different mediums. This is why our subject matter today in creating diverse libraries, so that people may understand how relevant this is extremely important. Black men and women living in this country, living in the United States, living all over the world, have had their lives affected and shaped by so many things. In some cases, in the Maritimes, in Canada, in the southern part of the United States, by incidents and by events much more serious than lack of representation on television, in books, or popular media, sometimes marred by violence, lynchings, and death. Black people are affected throughout the world, and all people of color, all people who do not fit the majority of the ruling class are affected. This is why in the 1930s, a drunkard by the name of Elijah Poole became Elijah Muhammad. This is why in the 1950s, a prison convict named Malcolm Little became Malcolm X, and then later El Hajj Malik El-Shabazz. He wasn't Malcolm Little or Little anymore. This is why a young heavyweight champion by the name of Cassius Marcellus Clay became Muhammad Ali. And this is why a lost 20-year-old musician and high school dropout by the name of Duke Eatmon became Muhammad Isa, and then later Shabazz Muhammad. Interactions and incidents and moments of hatred, confusion, and then clarity bring about change in people who are treated like this. And this is how people are affected. It can gear your political views. It can gear your spiritual views. And this is not to take away spiritual convictions of converting to another religion different than the ruling one in any particular society, or to change political ideologies, or even different outlooks on life. But this is what happens, man. This is how people are affected, and it starts from a very early age. Now, I was protected. I was protected by my parents, who in the 1960s understood this world and what it brings and how it can mess people up. Now, my parents also had a very limited formal education, but by no means were they uneducated about life. My mother was about 17 years old when she got pregnant with me. She was still a kid. My father was in his mid-20s. My father was from Elm Hill, New Brunswick, one of the first Black settlements in all of Canada. Elm Hill, New Brunswick was a rural settlement given to Blacks who had escaped the American slave colony of Virginia in the United States. My forefathers were slaves from Virginia. The Queen of England at that time had allotted plots of land in New Brunswick when she still had some say about what was going on in Canada. Allotted plots of land in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia to runaway slaves who had come up through the Underground Railroad to farm and to be able to earn a living. And my grandmother was 16 years old when she gave birth to my father on December 28, 1941, during the Christmas holidays. She was right back in class in high school when the Christmas holidays were done. Mary Haynes, my beautiful grandmother, a singer and guitar player, who gave birth to 4 children, my dad, Wendell, my uncle, Edward, who's now deceased, and of course, my aunts, Marilyn and Cheryl, who are still with us. So my family was of African-American origin, coming through Canada, being Afro-Canadian, with Bajan ancestry through blood and Jamaican ancestry through marriage. My mother was of the Iroquois nation with Irish blood as well on her father's side. Now, my grandmother was a big, strong, solid woman with beautiful indigenous features, the darker skin, very high forehead with long dark hair, dark eyes. Actually, her eyes were kind of more closer to mine, looked like a warrior. My mother looked more like a Caucasian than she did indigenous, and like many indigenous people because of some of the darker parts of our history. Also not different than that of many Black people as well. So this afforded me a very exotic and ambiguous physical look as well. I was able to navigate amongst my own people who knew who I was, but I was also able to navigate amongst white people who were often nervous at times and had to be very careful about what they said, just in case. And some of them still say the same thing. He might be Hispanic. He looks like he's Egyptian, maybe from the Middle East, or maybe he's one of them. Oh, Walter, you better be careful what you say. Okay, Karen. And if you're looking on the screen, that's my mother at 15 years of age with the legendary soul singer Joe Tex in his dressing room after a performance. And my father was one of the greatest amateur fighters in all of the country, winning Golden Glove tournaments in the middleweight and light heavyweight division. In Canada, he was a southpaw. Unfortunately, the color of his race prevented him from moving to where he should have been, which should have been as a world champion in the pros. But I'm going to be honest with you. Looking the way I look, I learned a lot about white people, oftentimes without meaning to, keeping them on edge, which forced them to watch what they say. I remember as a child, a little girl said to me, "Are your parents Negro?" I'm serious. I said, "No, they're Wendell and Linda." Reminds me of Muhammad Ali stepping into a segregated restaurant where they told him, "We don't serve Negroes here." And he said, "That's good because I don't eat them, but I'll take a cheeseburger." But seriously, my parents armed me. Now, my dad bought me a blue Superman lunchbox, but take pictures of heavyweight champion Muhammad Ali over it, because although he loved Superman as a kid, he wanted a superhero that I could relate to better. Again, this may seem like it's moving away from books in the library, but it's all part of the media that all basically plays a role in the shaping of young people and young minds. The following year, they started making Fat Albert lunchboxes, and my father bought me one of those until Marco, one of my older Italian students at Maple Hill Elementary, took it and smashed it and said, "Go home, nigger." That's a true story. I won't even begin to tell you how that was dealt with. Now, my father kept me home on Dr. King and Malcolm X's birthdays, and he taught me history that I could barely comprehend, but could appreciate at least better than I could what I had read in the Asterix and Obelix books. Now, remember, my parents were young. Going to concerts was a thing, as it was for all people in their teens and 20s in those days, as it is today. My very first show, I was just shy of my second birthday, and my father put me on stage with the king of rock and roll, Chuck Berry, and I did the duck walk across the stage with Chuck. The king of rock and roll, Chuck Berry. Did I say Elvis? No, Chuck Berry, the true king and architect of rock and roll. My second concert, my next show, was less than a year later, and it was James Brown at the Montreal Forum. Now, my mother had camped out all night to get tickets, center stage, 5 rows from the front. Now, you got to understand, we were dirt poor when I was young. And $350 for a concert ticket. And okay, you're going to laugh when you compare it to the $350 it takes to go see a Genesis reunion concert today. But in 1972, $350 was a lot of money for a family that existed on very little. But these were things that my parents would scrimp and save for and borrow money from their parents for. I'm sure for their own entertainment, but also for what it is that they wanted to instill in me. I remember that night also like it was yesterday. I danced in the aisles all night. James Brown looking at me and pointing right at me. Probably pointing at a beautiful woman dancing in back of me, but for me, he was pointing at me. A couple of years later, James Brown is playing at Place des Arts. And we got to the venue extremely early. And anybody that knows the Place des Arts complex, downtown Montreal in the Quartier de Spectacle area on St. Catherine Street, there's corridors connected to the subway where you get in, and we still didn't own a car yet. My parents had only owned a car, I think, when I was 8. So we obviously took public transit down. And I remember coming through those corridors at Place des Arts, and it was sold out. I think Place des Arts sits maybe 3,500, maybe 4,000 at most. It was sold out. And remember seeing all these people in line to see my hero, the Godfather of Soul, James Brown. And I saw, like my family, Black people. I saw Indigenous people, but I also saw Italian, Greek. I saw people of Middle Eastern descent. I saw Asians. I saw people from so many different diverse backgrounds to come see this Black man. The type of man that had been mocked in some of the library books that I borrowed outside of my elementary school. And just seeing everybody in line to see this man. And I remember there was a couple who appeared to be in their late 40s, 50s, with teenage children. They were speaking Italian. I didn't know what they were saying, but every once in a while I could make out James Brown, Godfather of Soul. And as a child, now by this point, I'm like 6, taking all this in, my parents making me part of this and watching all these people to come see somebody that looked like my family, it had an impact on me because a lot of the hatred and negative imagery that I was privy to as a child had now been balanced out. Had been balanced out to going to school with my Fat Albert lunchbox, my Ebony Junior subscription that I would read instead of going to so-called religion class, all these things. And so it played an impact on the way that I saw myself and the way that I saw my people. I had gone to many shows after that. This was a part of who we were. We came from a very musical family, but that event stands out most in my life as something that really shaped how I saw myself. I bought a program. Well, my parents bought me the program that night. Full-colored program, maybe, I don't know, a dozen pages, which I still own till this very day, which I have at home. And I break it out every once in a while and I show people. And looking back, even now at 52 years of age, I'm able to go back into that mindset of that young child whose mind could have easily been poisoned and taken to another negative place altogether, had it saved by examples of literature, toys. I had lots of toys. I remember my father and mother had gone to New York City one year. I didn't get to go with them. I stayed home with my great-grandmother, but my father brought me back an O.J. Simpson doll. Now, I know O.J. is quite the controversial character today, but back then he was the greatest football player alive. And while my friends had G.I. Joe, which I thought were cool too, which I had an O.J. doll. I had a doll that looked like my family. The hot show at the time was Good Times. I had a JJ doll with the words dynamite on his t-shirt. to go along with my Fat Albert lunchbox and my Ebony Jr. Muhammad Ali was heavyweight champion of the world then. And I, of course, had the Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier action figure dolls with the ring that came with it. Don't think when I give you these examples, which are part of my history and a part of who I am, were common, because a lot of my Black friends didn't have these things. And a lot of my Black friends went through different emotional traumas of always being different and always having to deal with the way society was, with the hatred that existed in the world, right down to the sort of things we would read in those Asterix and Obelix and Tintin books. It saved me. And it brought about a very different way of looking at life. And, you know, it's so essential and so important to arm your children when they're not part of the ruling class in this society with things that they can be proud of, things that have contributed to this society and the betterment of this world, that they can develop pride and dignity in who they are. You know, I noticed that a lot of my Black friends who are fairer skinned like myself went through a lot of emotional trauma because they were never accepted as white people amongst white people and never considered Black enough with Black friends in the Black community. I was very fortunate enough, as fair as I am, to never go through that because I was armed with knowledge of self. So as light as I probably was the Blackest kid in the neighborhood because I knew my history, I knew my people, I knew my culture, my literature, I knew my God. My father, at Christmas, we had, you know, baby Jesus in the manger and Mary and Joseph, and we had the kings. My father painted all those figures Black. Now, mind you, we didn't have brown as a color, so he painted them literally Black. They were kind of scary looking, but I got what my father was trying to do. We didn't have to paint the kings because at least history was able to protect the fact that those kings were Black. I was armed with that, so I never went through that. It was never, you know, you're very fair skinned, so you're not really Black. No, Black kids knew better because I knew them and their history better than they knew themselves. I never went through a lot of those complexes. You see a lot of that, not just from someone like myself, let's say, with a Black father and an Indigenous mother. You have it with people that have a Black parent and a Caucasian parent or different things and whatnot. And it's a trauma that a lot of people go through, which could easily be counterbalanced by arming young people with knowledge of self and racial pride and dignity. It helped me navigate through a lot of things. There was other traumas in my life. Poverty is always something that brings about trauma. Different things, whether they be alcoholism or drug addiction, different things. Things that all of us in society, if we haven't gone through them, we know someone that has. But at least as far as that identity went, I never had a sense of self-hatred. Being a Black child and a Black man, I never had a sense of not belonging in society and not being a part of it because I knew what part of it I had contributed. And I knew what part of it my family and my people had contributed to it. It's extremely essential. I know we got to wrap up very soon. I want to end with this example. About 10 years ago, I had gone to the Dollar des Ormeaux library for something. I don't even remember why, because I was a Pierrefonds resident. And I usually used to go to the Pierrefonds library. But at that time, so it might have been 10 years ago, because the cities were kind of joined together. You could take something out from the Pierrefonds library and return it to the DDO library. And of course, that's before we had the amalgamation of the boroughs with Montreal and whatnot. But I was at the DDO library, and it was Black History Month. And I was going to do something. And there was a table set up for Black History Month. And on the table, there were all these Black books. And I'm sure at the core of it, whoever had decided at the DDO library to put this together had the best of intentions to observe and to recognize that this was Black History Month. But what they had on the table is they had a book about Whitney Houston. And I don't mean a book that was detailing her musical contributions and her artistic achievements in society and the world, but a book that basically was detailing her struggles with drug abuse and Bobby Brown, and Bobby Brown corrupted her and whatnot. Then there was another book about Oprah Winfrey, which also seemed to be almost written by somebody who probably worked as a journalist for the National Enquirer. There was a copy of Alice Walker's The Color Purple. Mind you, a book that had been controversial in the 1980s, and a film that had been controversial in the 1980s amongst the grassroots of Black people and Black leadership because of its perceived negative portrayal of Black men in the book. So again, not something that was always very adored and loved by the grassroots Black community. A very popular film, I believe Steven Spielberg involved. Oprah Winfrey got a big break, Whoopi Goldberg, Danny Glover. But again, a book and a film that had been rather controversial and still till this very day amongst the grassroots of the Black community. There were no books on Malcolm X or Dr. King or Harriet Tubman. There were no books on, let's say, entertainers, if they wanted to feature entertainers, like James Brown and Prince and Curtis Mayfield and Bob Marley, who had melded politics and sociology into their music. There were none of these things. There were nothing about all our great Black inventors, all our great Black women that were responsible for freedom during our sojourn here in the Western Hemisphere, North America. It was just Black faces. It was a book on Whitney Houston's drug addiction, Oprah Winfrey, Color Purple, and whatever else was available. I'm ending with that example because it's important to really look at it, what this symposium represents and what it is that we're talking about today. Because if you are going to have diverse libraries for inclusion of all in this society, take your time and choose it wisely. Matter of fact, confer with other Black people. If you're going to, in this example, commemorate Black History Month, the same should be done for the Indian community, whether Hindu or Muslim. It should be done for the Jewish community. It should be done for the Asian community. It should be done for every other community. I give this example because it was Black History Month. I'm a Black man and I interacted. Nobody thought to talk to somebody from the community and say, what do you recommend we put out there for people to read about if they want to learn about the history of Black people? I think reaching out to people would have made a difference, saying, you know what, there's a lot in there about Whitney Houston's addiction to cocaine and Bobby Brown and whatnot. Color Purple, still an iffy book amongst the Black community. Maybe not necessarily that if you're going to put a fictional work. There are many other great fictional works that you could have put out there. Political leaders, first and foremost, are important. Also our inventors and those that have changed the world so that people don't only think that Black people are great basketball players and can sing and dance, but have contributed to other parts of this society. Everything from the invention of the traffic light to the elevator. Everything you can think of, gas masks. I mean, it doesn't stop. Inclusive libraries mean not just literature that involves Black people, but that literature that can change the mindset of not only the ruling class in society, but also for people of color who want to know who they are, how important and beautiful they are, and what they've contributed. I want to, first of all, thank everybody for your time. I know we only have a few minutes left for question and answer. We're going, I think I went a few minutes over my time limit, but I'm really grateful for your ear and your hearts today. It means a lot to me. I don't take this lightly. And the initiative that the Quebec Schools Library Network has put forth, and the initiatives that I see in other areas as well, continues to grow, continues to be supported. I will support it in every way that I can. And I just want to thank you. I want to thank all of the above people that I mentioned. And it was a pleasure and an honor. Again, I must take the opportunity to thank the West Island Black Community Association for making this venue available. And Anybody that has any questions, whatever time limit we have, I'd be more than happy to answer them. But I want to thank Julian Taylor and everybody online listening. Thank you very much, and God bless you.
Wow. Thank you. That was very I don't, inspiring isn't even the right word, but I really like a lot of the things you were saying in there. And you're saying like at the Pierre Fondallard Library, and the display, and that is something that of course all of our school libraries are doing whenever there is something. So I like the way you approach it, and I was like, we want to make sure that we give it's impossible to tell the entire story, but to have a more complete story and reaching out to people from those communities and trying to get their input so that it is more real, more complete.
Yeah.
And
don't get me wrong, I love Whitney Houston.
I
love Oprah Winfrey and Whoopi Goldberg and Danny Glover and all that stuff.
I will admit I have heard a few Whitney Houston songs and they are on my playlist, but I'm not going to talk about that now. But yes.
But I meant something that would tell the story from a different perspective rather than the same one that we are familiar with every time we turn on a music video channel or the radio.
Yeah, I agree. So before I go on too much more, I would actually like to ask if there's anyone from the group here who would like to ask some questions. I see some very positive comments in the chat. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for sharing your stories with us. This is so important to hear. Is there anyone who has a specific question? Oh, awesome. Now it's going back to obviously the history.
First of all, I see all the comments.
You're seeing them yourself. That's true. Sorry.
Yeah, they're beautiful. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you, everybody.
Okay.
And please don't be shy. I'm willing to answer whatever I will attempt to anyway.
Okay. And also Duke, don't feel bad about taking extra time, because we did end up having to end a little bit late, so it's quite all right. I mean, the previous session went a bit longer than we expected, so don't worry about that.
By the way, I enjoyed that. I wanted to make an effort to watch everything all day, but I'll be honest, I was spending most of the day prepping and getting everything ready and putting you on the spot, sending my visuals not that long before we went on the air.
No, it is challenging for Christopher and I, but we got it.
Yeah. With the sister, and it was really, really moving. I really enjoyed it.
Okay. I see that Pascal Duguay has her hand up. Pascal, would you care to unmute and ask your question?
Hello. Well, first, thanks of all. I really like your speech.
Thank you.
I was surprised when you talked about Asterix, because that's what I grew up on. Also, my son is biracial, and I read those books with him. And it's weird that I never stopped to think about those things as I read them with him, or that he even didn't say anything. So now I'm gonna go through all my Asterix and read them all over and look at them through a new eye. And I want to thank you for that.
You're welcome. Well, that was over 40 years ago, and I'm hoping that if they're still publishing Asterix and Obelix today, that they changed, that they see it very different, that people in France see it very different. Although watching some of the political upheaval in France going on right now, I don't know if they do. And I would like to think that maybe the Quebec government, which allowed a lot of these books to enter the elementary schools, see it different, and that the images have changed, and that Asterix and Obelix are woke, so to speak. Thank you.
There's also a question here from Tina Firstman. You mentioned your change of names from Duke to Muhammad. Can you elaborate?
I converted to Islam when I was 21 years of age. At the time, it was more of a militant stance of wanting to change everything in this society. A religion that was forced upon my forefathers through the transatlantic slave trade, names that we had that were the names of those that owned my ancestors. And so it came purely from a pro-Black militant standpoint. I had changed my name to Muhammad Isa, and of course, Muhammad being the last prophet in Islam, Isa, which is the Arabic translation of Jesus, because I had come out of the Baptist Christian tradition. And then later on, through consultation with my cousin, who was also a Muslim, who passed away 2 years ago, I changed my name to Shabazz Muhammad. I don't use it professionally because I've built a name in the industry that people relate to so much, and not wanting to confuse people and whatnot. People know Duke Eatmon from so long in radio and television and print, but my actual spiritual name is Shabazz Muhammad. People from the Muslim community refer to me to that, but Duke Eatmon is the name I'm also proud of because that was the name that my parents gave me. And they gave me that with, love from their hearts and whatnot. Obviously, Eatmon, Eatmon, was the name of somebody that owned my forefathers years ago. It only became a spiritual thing when I got older. I don't know that at 21, or I know at least myself at 21, I wasn't very spiritually inclined. That development only started in my 30s, where I started to understand things from a very spiritual standpoint, what Islam meant to me spiritually. But initially, it was just a militant stance, which I think for a lot of Black people living in the West, meaning more so North America, but I would say Western Hemisphere and Europe as well, a name change, religion change, wanting to go back to what it was that my ancestors who came here as slaves were. It only became a spiritual awakening much later. And now there's no real militancy to it. It's more of a spiritual path for me. But initially at 21, just being angry, young and Black.
Penelope Joy Webster was able to finish her question from before. Hi, Duke. You obviously know a lot about Black history in the States. Do you feel that Black Canadians' contributions are ignored?
Absolutely. I gave you a little bit of a brief background. My father grew up in Elm Hill, New Brunswick, one of the first settlements. This is going back to the 1800s in Canada. And like I had said, the Queen of England at that time had allotted land to those that had come up through the Underground Railroad. Now, there's talk about Harriet Tubman being put on the $20 bill in the United States. The reason why I say talk is because we haven't really seen that change in currency. People seem to forget that Harriet Tubman's role as a slave liberator was to remove slaves of African descent in the United States into Canada, which had already abolished slavery a little bit before the United States. Mind you, when a lot of my ancestors and forefathers got to New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, they found a lot of the white people in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick to be more brutal than those in the southern part of the United States. And that history is well documented in Canadian history books. But so there is a history there, a history that you can't tell the Canadian story without telling that story, just like you can't tell the American story without telling the Black American story. It's obviously ignored because at least in schools in the United States, dating back to the 60s and 70s, you can read about Frederick Douglass, you can read about Harriet Tubman and Dr. King. Controversial characters like Nat Turner, Malcolm X, and Elijah Muhammad only came.
Is it just on my end? I believe that is frozen for everybody now.
It is, Julian, yes.
Well, that is unfortunate. At the same time,
here. Can you see me?
You're here?
Yes.
Okay.
Can you see me?
We cannot see you. At least I cannot see you. Okay. You're back again.
Camera.
In that case, I will remute myself and I'll allow you to continue, sir.
Okay. I see myself, so hopefully everybody can see me too, but you don't need to see me. You just need to hear me. The Porter, which details more recent history at the turn of the century of the Black community living in Little Burgundy, whose ancestors resembled mine in the sense that they were of African-American, African-Canadian, and Caribbean descent, and their times working as Pullman porters on the trains. I wouldn't say unfortunate, but one of the ironic aspects of it is that it was done in conjunction with BET. So I can say that the CBC got it right this time by collaborating with BET because they're showing this show in the United States as well. And it's funny because Arnold Pinnock told me when he was selling this to the networks, not BET, but another American network to collaborate with CBC, they just looked at him and said, trying to understand something here. There are Black people in Canada? And how did they get there? Not knowing that we left you to come here. So I think it's happening, but literally it's in the last 2 years. But if you study the history, Hogan's Alley in BC, in Vancouver, the history of Blacks in Ontario, the history of Black people in the Maritimes, the first settlements of Black people in Canada, in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and of course in Quebec, which I don't know that the government of Quebec is ready to actually tell some of that history. We hear a little bit about Marie Angelique, an African slave who was responsible for burning down half of old Montreal during that time in a revolt. But hopefully, the textbooks in Quebec here will evolve and become more liberal and show the history for what it is, something that happened, because that's what history is. But to answer your question, it is absolutely ignored. Blacks who are indigenous to Canada or foundational Blacks, and when I say that, I mean Black people like my ancestors who have been here for at least 200 years, know this history very well. Black people who are from other parts of the world, whether they're coming from the Caribbean, South America, Europe, or Africa, are not aware of this history. A lot of them think that Black people came here with the immigration boom of the 1950s and 60s. But Black people were enslaved in Canada, in Quebec as well. Quebec was the last of the territories to abolish slavery when it was known as Nouvelle France. And then eventually, after slavery was outlawed in Canada by the Queen of England, we had settlements of those that actually come up to the Underground Railroad, spearheaded by Harriet Tubman, and have been calling Canada their home for over 200 years. That history is relevant, it's important, and you cannot tell real Canadian history unless you tell the whole story, and that's an important part of the story. I hope that answers some of your questions.
Well, it was very thorough, and speaking as a person who does have, a history undergraduate degree, it's very nice to hear other people saying stuff like that too. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
We are right at the end. There's several very positive comments that are in the chat. I think there are no more hands. I'm just going to quickly scan. No, I think we're good. In that case, I think I'm going to say thank you, sir. This has been great. This is the second time I've seen you present, and as a librarian, I appreciate the fact that you included how libraries and schools were a part of your journey and what you shared with us today. And I think it made it more powerful and more relevant for our people. So I thank you for that, sir.
Thank you. And I want to end with these comments. What you're doing is very important. It all starts in the library. Great Black leaders since the 1960s have said the revolution is not something that's taking place in the streets right now in an armed revolt. The revolution is in the libraries, to become educated, to understand. And I would end by quoting one of my biggest heroes, the great Black American musical revolutionary, architect, and pioneer, Prince Rogers Nelson, who said, yes, books and libraries are very important. Like albums and Black lives, yes, they still matter. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And thank you for taking the time to be with us today. It is very much appreciated. And I also would really like to say thank you quite a bit, very powerfully, to Christopher Blouin from the New Frontier School Board, who was our Zoom technician for the session. There was a lot of stuff happening in the background to make the visuals work. So thank you, Christopher.